Today's daf is daf Kuf Ches, which is a very famous Mishnah called Tipas Cholav. So just by way of introduction, we're talking about a pot that's cooking with hot meat, and it also has smaller pieces of meat and rotev and a lot of different assorted kinds of liquids and soups, everything together in this one pot. And a drop of milk falls on the piece of meat. So there's a whole machlokas between Rashi and Tosfos exactly how the meat was situated. I don't know if we're going to get into this, but just on the surface level, according to Rashi, the meat is like half outside the soup and half inside the soup. But according to Tosfos, that can't be, because if the meat is partially in the soup, then halachically it's as if it's in the entire soup, and then the tipas cholav is considered as if it dissolved throughout the entire pot. And there's certainly shishim enough to be mavatal the tipas cholav. So therefore, when the Mishnah says tipas cholav shenafla ala chaticha, and em yesh ba b'nosein tam b'osa chaticha asur, according to Rashi, since the tipas cholav fell on the top part of the chaticha of that piece of meat, then it's not considered part of the entire pot. And then we focus our attention and concentrate on the relationship between that tipas cholav and that one single piece of meat. Tosfos, on the other hand, holds that if that piece of meat is partially submerged in the liquids in the soup or the pot, then it's considered as if the tipa fell into the entire pot. And yet our Mishnah says we focus totally on the ratio between the piece of meat and the tipas cholav. Therefore, Tosfos has to assume that this meat is literally on top of the top level of the pot. Like, let's say you have, piece of meat here. This piece of meat is just being held up above the pot. It's not at all sunk into the liquids of the pot. And that's why the tipas cholav is concentrated only on that chaticha itself. Okay, let's assume, whether we go with Rashi's pshat in the Mishnah or Tosfos' pshat in the Mishnah, that you cannot come up with 60 times the tipas cholav in that one single piece of meat. And the Mishnah says, therefore, it's asur. But what's the relationship now between that piece of meat and the rest of the pot? And on that, the Mishnah continues and says, Niras hakadera, if he takes a spoon and he mixes the entire kedera together, such that now the meat is totally submerged together with the soup, then we have to look at the relationship between the entire pot and that tipas cholav, which is a great advantage. So that a smart person, if he sees the tipas cholav landing on that chatich, he'll immediately stir the whole meat into the pot, because he has shishim 60 times in the pot itself against that tipas cholav. But we're going to soon see that that's not what happened. Instead of jumping up and stirring it, he waited a few minutes, and during that interval, there was time enough for the tipas cholav to penetrate throughout that one single chaticha. And now, by mixing that chaticha into the pot, he's just creating problems for himself, because now the entire chaticha becomes asura, and you don't have shishim against the entire chaticha in the soup in the pot. You only have shishim in that, in the pot against that tipas cholav. But he waited too long to stir the pot. Okay. Omar Abaye, Tamo Veloma Mosho Bi Alma de Oraisa. What that means is that we have a principle in mixtures called Tam Ki'ikar. And therefore, if you have the Tam of Isur that penetrates into Heter, even if it's Veloma Mosho, which means even if, let's say, you could somehow identify that piece of meat that's asur, but it doesn't matter. Why? Because the piece of meat was already cooked together with all the other pieces of heter meat. So the isur meat now gave off its tam of isur into the entire contents of the pot. And Abai says that will derive from Basar B'cholav the conclusion that the Torah prohibits the entire mixture because of the tam that was ejected, so to speak, from the Chatichas Isur and penetrated into the Chatichos of Heter. And Abai is going to try now to prove to us that this principle called Tama V'lo Mosho is indeed Doraisa. The Isal Kedaicha Rabbanon. Now Abai is going to argue from the opposite position. So let's say you would prefer and try to defend the position that the entire principle of Tam without the Ikar is only Rabbanon. Then Mibasa B'chol of my time Elo Gamrina. After all, the Torah says that if you cook milk together with meat, it becomes Basa B'chol and it's also. Now, what do you have in the meat? You have a tam of the cholov. And for example, if let's say it was a solid piece of cheese, for example, and you could identify that cheese, nevertheless, the Torah says once you cook that cheese with meat, the entire mixture becomes osur, and that's called Basa B'chol. That's what the Torah prohibits. The Torah has three prohibitions actually for Basa B'chol. One is for the Isur Bishul, not to cook Basa B'chol, which, by the way, is relevant if, let's say, a young Orthodox woman, it doesn't matter, woman or man, would participate in a cooking class. And it's very possible that in that class, they're going to ask her to turn on the fire. She has no intention of eating the mixture between cheese and meat, but she's not allowed to turn on the fire. So that's one Isur. And then we have the Isur of consumption, of Achila. And then finally, we have the Isur Hano, which means that you can't even feed Basa B'cholav to your neighbor who's not Jewish or to a dog. And now the question is, what is Basa B'cholav? After all, Basa B'cholav means that when you cook the cheese with the meat received the tam of the cheese. And that's what the Torah prohibits. So you see that tam ki'ikar, even without the mamoshas, even if you could somehow identify the cheese and remove it, nevertheless, it's awesome. And what are you going to tell me? You're going to tell me maybe we can't derive any conclusions for Basa B'cholav. Again, this is all Abaye's like arguing against an argument against him. You know, there's like a phantom bar plugta that he's fighting with. Maybe we'll say that Basa B'cholav is a chidushu. Chidushu means, possibly chidushu means, where do we find that the Torah prohibits cooking meat? Cooking Isur with heter or whatever else. So the very fact that there's an Isur Bishul in Basa B'cholav, that itself is a chidush. That puts Basa B'cholav in its own category. And furthermore, what we find in Basa B'cholav is that zeh heter b'fnei atzmo v'zeh heter b'fnei atzmo. Now this is Rashi's pitch over here, that the reason why Basa B'cholav is a chiddush is because you're taking two substances, each one is heter. The basar is mutter, it's after shchita, and the cheese is mutter, and you cook them together, and all of a sudden, boom, it becomes also. That's a big chiddush. Tosa says that that's not what the Gemara has in mind, because we have a precedent for such a thing in Kilayim. So therefore, Tosa goes with the other pshat. It's a chidush because it's also an Isur Bishul. And not only that, the Isur Achila is what's called Derech Bishul Asur Torah. It's not pshat that you're not allowed to eat cholav and basar. You're allowed to eat basar with cholav. The Torah never biblically prohibited eating basar and cholav together. The Torah prohibited the result of cooking the basar with the cholav. So like, for example, if let's say you would take cheese and soak it in basar for 24 hours, which is called kavush. And there's definitely an asinas tam that goes from the cholav into the basar, the cheese into the meat, but nevertheless it's mutter according to Torah law because there was no act of bishul. So that's what Tosafos interprets as the chidush, that the Torah only prohibits the result or the product of bishul. So then Abai says, I'm going to argue against you, and I'm going to say, chidushu afal gav de lekanosein tam nami, that it should be usher even if there is no nesinas tam. Because what are you telling me about a chiddush? The chiddush is that you went ahead and you cooked meat and milk. And the product of that cooking is now basar b'chola. Well, guess what? Who cares whether there's nesinas tam? The very fact that you cooked the meat and the milk and they were both cooked together, you have now an entity that is a product of meat plus milk. That itself should be also. And yet our Mishnah says that it all depends on nesinas tam. So when the cholav is cooked with the basar, when the tipas cholav falls on the top piece of meat, then it's not asur if there's bittul. Meaning if you have 60 times in the meat against the tipas cholav. Why not? I mean, that must be based on the fact that it all depends on the nesinas tam. So you can't tell me that basar b'chola is a chiddush. If it was a chiddush, it wouldn't depend upon the nesinas tam. It would be any combination of meat and milk, with or without tam. You know, you could give it after you cook it together, give it to a kfeli, give it to a non-Jewish chef, and he says, I taste meat, I don't taste any milk over here. It would still be awesome because you cooked meat and milk together. So therefore, Abai comes to the conclusion that since the Torah prohibits meat and milk together only when there's the sinus tam, then it's not a chiddush. That basically it operates within the same rules and regulations that apply to any mixture of any isur v'heter. And therefore, we're going to have to derive from basar b'chola that the Torah prohibits the tam in the basar that came from the cholav, and that's called tamo v'lo mamosha. Only Abai is going to go back to chidush, and he's going to insist, as we said originally, like the antagonist of Abai, that basar b'chola is a chidush. I mean, how can you tell me that you take two things that are heter and you put them together and boom, all of a sudden becomes asur? And not only that, it's only asur if it's derech bishul asur Torah. And therefore, Rava says, you know what? Don't derive any conclusions from basar b'chola because the chiddush of basar b'chola is derech bishul asur Torah. Now, if derech bishul asur Torah makes basar b'chola into the chiddush, and therefore we can't derive tamo v'lo mamosho min Torah from basar b'chola, then we're stuck with Abai's objection, his kasha, namely, why didn't the Torah prohibit basar b'chola, derech bishul, even if there is no nesinas tam? And Rav is going to have to somehow address that question. And by the way, all the Rishonim say that the final conclusion of this Gemara is like Rava, as it always is against Abaye. But here in particular, the law follows Rava, and the halacha of tamo v'lo mamosha is also is only d'Rabbanan. Anyway, let's go back to the Gemara now. Omar Rav. And this is the famous principle that's attributed to Rav called Chaticha Atzma Nasis Nevela. Kevan Shedosan Tam B'Chaticha, if there's not Shishim in the basar that received the tam, that received the tipas cholav against the tipas cholav, then Chaticha Atzma Nasis Nevela. Now, forget about the fact that the piece of meat is carrying the tam of cholav. It's a carrier. No. It's not a carrier. It itself is what we call a chefta disur. It's inherently duch and duch. It's also. It's nevela. It's like a piece of nevela. Now, why get so dramatic about it? Why do you have to conceptually categorize the nesinas tam of the cholav into the basar as nevela? What do you gain by that? And the Gemara says, and afkamina is that oseres kol hachatichos kula mipnei shein mina. Whoa, this is big time. Rav is saying that if you mix this piece of meat together with all the other pieces of meat after that piece of meat already received the tam of cholav, you're going to now need shishim if you want to be matter the balance of the kedera, the soup, and the small piece of meat that float to the top and whatever have you, only if you have shishim against the entire chaticha. You would have said logically, as long as there's shishim against the tipas cholav, that should be enough. And therefore, certainly we have 60 against the tipas cholav. Says Rav, that's not sufficient. You're now going to need a bittul against the entire chaticha. But the problem is that your pot is full of other pieces of meat, other chatichos basar of heter, and now the chatichas basar that received the tipas chol, which is no longer a carrier, but it inherently, in and of itself, becomes a chatika nevela, then we have a problem of min bimino. And here Rav is standing on the shoulders of the famous Shita Rabbi Yehuda, which we've had earlier in Shas a few times, that min bimino afilu be'elef lo bottle. There's no such thing as bittul with regard to min bimino. And now that piece of meat that received the tam of the tipas cholov is min bimino with all the other pieces of meat. They're all one min. And therefore Rav insists there won't be any bittul, because even if you had 1,000 pieces of meat of heter in this pot against the one single piece of meat, it would still be asur because there's no bittul in min bimino. So could you imagine what the ratio is now between the original problematic or problem maker, problem generator tipas cholav? It's a little tipas cholav, and look at its relationship to the entire kadera. Right, it's probably a ratio of one in a couple of thousand, and yet it asks the entire mixture. Why? Because it chaticha atzmanas nevela and min b'mino afilu elef lo bot. Amalei Mar Zutra Breder Rav Morilu Ravina Michti. Rav Kiman Omer L'Shmaita. Rav is standing on whose shoulders? Ki Rabbi Yehuda. Right, Rabbi Yehuda was the one who looked at the avod of Yom Kippurim, where you mix, the Torah tells you to mix the dam hasoyer with the dam hapar, and that's dam b'dam, and you do the hazos on the mizbeach. Why? One of them should be mevatel the other one. There's more dam in the par than there is in the soyer. But no, the Torah recognizes the dam hasoyer as if it still retains its identity and there's no bittul, says Rabbi Yehuda, because min b'mino, it's dam b'dam. And now Rav is standing on the shoulders of Rabbi Yehuda, and he's accepting that principle that min b'mino aino bata.
Can I just ask?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Does min b'mino have to be exactly the same liquid or just a liquid? Milk to milk is min b'mino. Milk to apple juice. Is that min b'mino?
No, I would say that's min b'sheno mino. I think min b'mino means it has the same time.
The same liquid.
Yeah.
Oh, I see, the same time.
It's complicated because there's one man, the Omer says it goes basa shma. It depends not on the time, but the way you call it and the way it's named. But nevertheless, apple juice has its own name. So apple juice and water would probably be min b'sheno mino.
Okay.
So the Gemara says, Lema pliga adarova. Tiyama Rava Kasov Rabbi Yehuda, Kolshu min umino v'dover acher, Salekes mino kimi she'eno, v'she'eno mino rabolav u'mevatla. Now, where is this coming from? We had it not long ago. I'm just for my own curiosity, I want to remember where it came from. Menachos Daf Chav Gimel, and back on Daf Kuf, just a blot ago. So what happens here in Rava's analysis of Rabbi Yehuda? You've got a mixture of min, that min is asur, and on the other side you have mino and eno mino. Like for example, in our case where the basar falls into a pot that has both basar and rotev meaning the liquids. So as far as the other piece of meat in the pot, you're min b'mino. But as far as the rotev is concerned, it's min b'sheno mino. So Rava says that according to Rabbi Yehuda in that case, salekes mino k'misheno. Don't pay any attention to the mino, meaning put the piece of meat on the side, so to speak. I don't mean it physically, but conceptually. And then gauge what the ratio is between the eno mino and the mino. And here we apply the principle of bittul. So if in the eno mino, that means the liquids and the soup that's inside the pot, there's shishim against the chatichas isur, then you're mevatel the chatichas isur, and now what we have is all the chatichas of heter together with the soup, and therefore everything is mutter. So that's the logic here of Mar Zutra, and he says the following. Amalei, Rav Mori, I'm sorry, Ravina says the following. You know what? I'm not sure that the Rotev is Eno Mino vis-a-vis the Basa. Why? Because there are two types, two categories of Rotev. There's one soup and another soup. Enough of Rotev Raka. So you have Rotev Raka, and we're going to see this Rotev Ava. Like sometimes you have a soup that's so thick that for all intents and purposes, it's almost like a salad. So therefore, what is Marzutra? What is the counter of Ravina to Marzutra? Then you would be right if we're talking about Rotev Raka, because Rotev Raka has a totally different propensity than a piece of meat. It's totally liquid. And therefore, we would have to we would apply the principle of Rav of Salek es mino kamisha edo. But Hachamai Eskina, what's the case in our Mishnah? It's nafal rotav ava. It's a very thick soup, and the thick soup is thick because it's made up like if you've ever seen a mushroom barley soup. You know, it's like the mushrooms and the barley make up the soup. The soup becomes like the mushroom and barley. Here we have a meat soup, and there's so many pieces of meat in the soup, whether a large piece of meat, small piece of meat, whatever it is, that the gravy itself becomes like meat. It's like liquefied, and it becomes a min b'min. Okay, now we get to the main sugya for today, and that's called Efshel Sochta, or Efshel Sochta. What's this all about? So what we need to set up here is a chronological sequence. We'll call it time T1 and time T2. Now, time T1 is when the Isser gets mixed up with Heter. There's not enough in the Heter, a volume of Shishim, to be Mavato the Isser, so that now the mixture becomes Osir. But now he, so to speak, cooks it again a second time. That's time T2. And now he's got Shishim in the second cooking. So can we say that the original Isser that penetrated and dissolved in the Heter, and there was no Shishim, now that original Isser gets dispersed in the second cooking throughout the entire pot? That's called Efshel Sochto Mutter. And what we're going to do is then when we apply Shishim against the Tipas Chalav, then we're going to assume that that Tipas Chalav that penetrated into the meat was now extracted from the meat through the second cooking, and the Shishim in the second cooking. My kasava, what does Rav hold? I have a problem here, says the Gemara. Ika savar efshel soto mutter is chaticha my nasis nevela. I don't get it. If you could remove that tipas chola, that drop of milk that penetrated into the original piece of meat by mixing the whole thing together and creating T2, what I call the second bishul, and now we can extract that tipas chola from the meat. So why do you call it nevela? Adarabah. Efshel is soto mutter. You could be matir a taroves where there was an asinus tam by removing that tam. Let's just extract it. So that's impossible because Rav says chaticha atzmanas nevela, and the original chaticha remains osur no matter what, forever and ever. Ad bias goel, and you can't extract the tipas chol. It's now part of the very essence of the object. That's called nevela. Elo, so by proselytization, you're gonna have to assume that kosavar that Rav holds efshel is soto osur. Fine. A beautiful analysis of the Gemara, and the Gemara is saying now that once it's nevela, then there's no efshel sokto mutter, it's efshel sokto osir, because now through and through, every fiber of that piece of meat that received the milk is osir. Ti itmar, that's exactly how we learned it. That Rav Chanina, Rav Yochanan, Efshel Soto Asur. Who disagrees with that whole cadre of Amoraim? That's Rav Shimon ben Bar Rebbe and Reish Lakish Amri. Efshel Soto Mut. So it seemed from this Gemara that there's one shita of Reish Lakish and Rabbi and Shmuel that they hold that chaticha is not nevela. The chaticha is only a carrier of the tipas cholav. It doesn't become nevela, and therefore, if we could get rid of that tipas cholav in the second cooking, then everything becomes mut. Frek the Gemara, v'sava Rav efshel soto asur v'yitmar. I'm going to prove to you that Rav is actually of the opinion that efshel soto mutter. How so? Kizayis basar shenaflu toch yoresh shel cholav amarav basar asur v'cholav mutter. This is unbelievable. Who would even imagine such a thing? That if you have a kizayis of basar and it fell into a large pot of milk, then the milk remains mutter. I don't get it. The milk is now cooking with that basar. So how can you tell me that only the meat is asur and not the milk? So this is based on an analysis of the pasuk, as we'll soon see. Not necessarily a logical conclusion. How can you tell me that the cholav is mutter? Cholav alay mutter, cholav nevelahu.